I got introduced to the idea of New Brunswick redevelopment through a colloquium at Douglas College when I was a junior. And at that point, there were 3 panelists. One was John Lynch as the mayor, another was Paul Abdallah, who had been the president of Devco, and I believe the third was John Heldridge. And it was a very, very heated conversation with mostly Douglas students who were speaking out about safety issues with the city, where was the city going, and at that point in my life I was an economics major, and they started
and that was
to
roughly
talk.
when? Is that wrong?
Do I have to tell that? That was probably 82, 83. And I started to ask some questions, and I was handed a note after the colloquium that Mayor Lynch would like to speak to me after the colloquium, and he pulled me aside, and he had gotten a little, and I don't know how many people have mentioned his personality in the process, but a little passionate with his answers. And I thought, oh, this guy's gonna, really yell at me for kind of putting him on the spot. And he said, I thought although I got aggravated, I thought your questions were good. I'm looking for an intern, and I'm looking for somebody that thinks differently. Come to my office on Monday. So I went to his office on Monday. I had no idea what urban planning was. I was, going off to school in London. I was going to be an arbitrager. I had no interest in this. And he started to talk to me and tell me what his vision was for the city and how he needed somebody to think about the city the way you would think about economics and a model, instead of what he was hearing, which was more architects and planners. And he said there's something called economic development, which at that point was really not a track or something that people identified with. And he said, you need to go talk to some people over at the planning school, which I did. I believe I may have met with David, and I met with a couple of other people. And I sat through like an orientation that they would do for new students. And I know it sounds like cliche, but the bells went off. And I said, oh, this is really interesting. I could get my arms around it. And to my parents' dismay, told them that I would not be following these other grandiose paths, and I had decided to be an urban planner, which my father said, you will work for government the rest of your life, with disdain. And I said, okay, so the only way to get my parents to pay for graduate school was to agree that I would do a law degree at the same time, because they didn't believe in urban planning as a career. And it was one of the first years that Rutgers was offering the JD law program. So I kind of signed up for that. But after the first semester, you didn't really go into that program until the second semester in graduate school. And by the second semester, there was no way I was going to be a lawyer. So I kind of just stayed on this track. That's how I got introduced to the whole. So these internships.
And you didn't go to London?
I went for just a summer, and I didn't spend a whole year. It was a lot of negotiations with parents back then.
I can understand. Right.
And then just to continue that,
where
your
did
personal,
I?
just for the record.
Okay, so what happens at that point is I begin to work for Mayor Lynch while I'm in graduate school. I get placed in the planning department, and so I was living and learning kind of while the city was really going through major transitions. Couldn't have been a better laboratory for me.
Was that before Glenn Patterson was there?
Oh, yeah.
So who was director then?
It was Nero. Frank Nero was the director. Paul Abdallah was the president of Devco, and I would work part-time for them and go to school. And the most interesting thing was really being part of 2 camps, because there was still a very anti-administration feeling against the city administration within some of the ranks of the faculty. and that was germane. I remember going through these questions. That was germane to the D designation of Hiram Market as a historic area. And so kind of walking that fine line of being in but not of both sides of the argument. I mean, I think for me it was wonderful because I could listen to both sides. I wasn't really, full-time employee, so I didn't have to stand there and voice the city's position and understand why people were having issues. So, it was a pretty interesting time for me, professionally. I then became the official city planner for the city about a year after I graduated. I went to the state for about an 8-month position at DCA, and that was prior to New Brunswick having an Office of Economic Development. They had, they had started to go down that road, but it really hadn't been structured. It was more a planning office. It still was doing mostly approvals, not master planning in the way that we know. And once it was really kind of solidified, they asked me to come back, and there was a job. So I came back, and then a few years later, became the president of the New Brunswick Development Corporation.
So that would have been in the later 80s?
Yeah, it was late 80s, early 90s. Yeah, I graduated from here in 86. So, but I think probably my interview is going to be different than most people because I was still a student, through some of the more interesting times. And so I was here and there, which was fun.
Right.
It was fun.
So you were at Devco, just to take us forward.
So I finished Devco.
Yeah.
I became the head of the New Jersey Mortgage Finance Agency. Really, probably because of David, I kind of had a passion for housing, and saw housing as a vehicle for economic development. So I went to the housing agency, and then after that started Community Investment Strategies, which is an affordable housing developer in New Jersey, and been doing that for the last 18 years.
Okay. Well, thank you for that background. And actually, if we could just start with, a little cue. I can imagine the reasons why, but if I can get your perspective on, what were the motivations for redevelopment, and maybe we can think about it from the different players. I guess J&J and Rutgers.
When I arrived on the scene, really, I think the redevelopment kind of efforts, it was really clear that there were very specific agendas. I'm going to speak really frankly, and I hope that's fine. Very clear agendas. I used to say that Johnson & Johnson's view of redevelopment was to stand from the executive lunchroom and look out the window, and the border of New Brunswick was only as far as you could see. And so they would only really be concerned about investment that was in that immediate vicinity, because they would take board members, look at what we're doing in the city. I was in those meetings, I would hear that. You had the city at that point was really struggling with the town-gown relationship. It was a real issue. I mean, it's amazing that it's not an issue, completely not an issue anymore. But it was huge because what was happening is in critical neighborhoods, very, very stable neighborhoods, mostly around main campus Rutgers, the housing was getting priced out of the reach of middle-income people. And the investor-driven market, by packing it with students, was just, phenomenal. And so when people would talk about gentrification in other cities, what was really the gentrifying kind of factor in New Brunswick was not the yuppie movement of the mid-late 80s. It was the pressure on the value of turning a single-family home into multi-units. And so you had a real clash between the city administration, and it felt like an anti-university movement, but it really wasn't. It was trying to preserve the stock. And I remember at that point, something like 70% of the housing stock in New Brunswick was held as a rental. And I think it was clear that the mayor then understood that unless he took a very strong stance, and some of it went over the top. I don't know if David remembers, but there was a movement to create a code violation for unrelated people living together, which was seen as an anti-student movement, which got challenged in court. There were pretty tough code people who would go in at 2 o'clock in the morning and throw kids out for overcrowding. And so the relationship between the university and the city was really rough. And on the university side was pressure because downtown wasn't safe. There was I used to say the cone zone was like the ice cream parlor that you could go and get beer, drugs, or ice cream, whatever you wanted. And it was, you didn't go by the train station late at night. And George Street, the whole linkage between the Douglas campus and downtown was, was non-existent. You really did feel like you were not part of the university because of that very difficult stretch, which, even after all of this, I think still isn't as strong as it could have been. That's what I saw.
So those town gown frictions, can you tie that back into like the redevelopment? Oh, okay, so we had that going.
So the first charge really, when in my period was to look at ways where we took a step back and said, okay, in the late 80s we were in a down cycle from a real estate market. We were not seeing a tremendous amount of other than institutional development. So the idea was to step back and say, okay, this is who we have. We have Johnson & Johnson, we have the hospital, and we have the university. How does the city say, this is who we are, how do we use it in our best case? So really the first kind of charge for me was to try and do the first downtown student housing, which the university was very against. Joe Whiteside was the treasurer. The arguments at that point were, we own all this land in Piscataway. Why would we embark on anything in downtown? It's not safe. Parents don't want students to live there. We said, well, join with us and we'll go out to the private sector, because the private sector, like today, was dying for any projects. So the hospital needed parking desperately. We wanted the university to do housing. So we kind of blended the two and came up with an agreement to do the Easton Avenue project. The issue there was the university was very slow to really commit to any kind of financial support. And
because just being conservative?
Just conservative.
That was the days when I was in the provost's office and worked with John Salapatis. I don't know if you remember him.
Yeah, I do.
He was, Kenneth, I think, liked it, but
right.
John was always...
The changing factor, and when I was reading your questions, that I think make New Brunswick unique and why it got done, was that Lynch held up the Rutgers budget in the Senate until we got the commitment
Really?
for the housing.
Wow.
And to be able to have that kind of power, I know people say this dual office holding is a bad thing for New Jersey. Most cities in New Jersey, when I've looked at them, and since I live in one that doesn't have the benefit of that kind of power, it's really a trade with the State House and what urban New Jersey gets. And without that dual role, I'm not sure a lot of what we see would have actually happened. The other big item when I was here was the move of the Rutgers bookstore to downtown, and I think I was on the other side of that argument because I think I was a Douglas student when it first started, and had to switch my argument when I got hired. But I think that was probably the turning point in the whole town gown kind of.
So whose initiative was that?
That was really Lynch's initiative, directly with Bloustein. And, I think that...
So these things were heavily driven by the city and the university was brought along.
Right. And I think the other interesting thing in what would get redeveloped, I was privy very early to these, every 6 months there was a meeting, and it would be Bloustein, at that time it was Dick Sellars at J&J, and it was Lynch. And they would lay out a course for the next 6 months, and they would look at who could deliver what. And at that point, we had Republican
and
president.
this was coming together under Devco or NBT, or just more coming together themselves?
Yeah, coming together themselves, and then they would each have a key person. But the interesting was, it wasn't the key people that met. They actually came to the table and committed to what piece of that next leg that everybody could agree upon.
Mhm.
So I wasn't at the table, but you could ask maybe predecessors of mine. One of those big items was the extension of Route 18. And J&J, Lynch said, I can't move the city forward unless we do something about Route 18. J&J had the power to get Washington funding and enlisted all of their lobbyists for the purpose of getting highway dollars for the extension of Route 18.
Now, why was that so important? Because it came into New Brunswick, but it didn't go beyond.
It didn't go beyond, and it was just, it was a mess, and you think traffic was bad now. Back then, you couldn't get anywhere. So I think people understood that unless you could move people in and out of the city, we were never going to attract any major, we weren't even going to see expansion of Johnson & Johnson. In fact, the J&J World Headquarters, the key point was, unless there was the extension of Route 18, the world headquarters was going to move out to the Jamesburg kind of area. So it was very critical. And those negotiations, I think set a tone that's that I haven't seen, and I've seen other kind of processes try to start, but key decision makers that actually had an ability to put, either their money or their efforts behind 3 things. They would pick 3 things that they wanted to accomplish in 6 months. I would just get the list of what I had accomplished out of that. And they would, and the bookstore, I know for Bloustein, was, very unpopular, but he committed that would happen, and it was the anchor tenant in order for the Farron deck to get done. So it was I think that, those early kind of projects were really a negotiation session between what then were the 3 critical players. I think now we'd really have a 4th, and the hospital would be part of that negotiation.
It's interesting that this morning we met with Roy Epps this morning. So we heard about the bookstore as well, and he said it was so important to get it on the other side of the trestle. But now the bookstore is going into this gateway building, and that's viewed as even better because it's going to be part of, the whole transit hub.
Right.
But it's a different world now.
Yeah.
Some of your perspectives on J&J in this big mix?
I don't think they deserve any of the kudos that they get for New Brunswick's revitalization. I think they built the world headquarters, and that was great. But in terms of being this, corporate giant that did everything that they could to support, I don't see it. There were many times that we called on them to make things a little bit easier for us. It was still viewed as, what is this the best decision for J&J first? There were many initiatives at being a Devco that I wanted to do in the neighborhoods, which I still think, one of your questions is, what didn't go right, and the neighborhoods, I still believe, were neglected, and basically could never garner any kind of support for true neighborhood revitalization because it wasn't visible when you came to J&J, and it wasn't glitzy enough, it wasn't big enough. So I think when you look at other cities and some of the housing initiatives that stabilize neighborhoods, New Brunswick is still far behind a lot of places when it had the resources to really be leading that charge. The only thing that in terms of like not a glitzy investment as part of the redevelopment that I have to credit Lynch on is very early on he spent a tremendous amount of CDBG money on infrastructure. When I was at the city, there was still a combined water and sewer system. The upgrades to then allow development had to occur. And he took a lot of heat because it was under the street. Nobody could see that investment. And he kept trying to explain to people, if I don't do this, it'll never come. And, that was a great lesson. I always remembered that because then as new projects came, they weren't saddled with this aging infrastructure that could not handle the kind of vision and development that, he had and people around here had.
The hospital and all this, and I realize, then it was Middlesex General, but were they...
during my tenure, they were just coming into their own. We were starting to do the master planning for the hospital campus. We had changed all the zoning. We had done redevelopment plans to acquire a lot of property. I would think going back, most of the major redevelopment projects was done through eminent domain, which now is such a bad word to talk about. Probably would never have gotten off the ground without. I would say 60% of the properties were acquired through eminent domain for most of the big projects.
For the hospitals?
For the hospital in particular.
And the county, where was the county in all this?
County was critical in the development of, buying the State Theater was, a really key piece to solidifying the Livingston Avenue corridor. Other things that the county would do were, they still were a pretty minor player when I was here. They had not had the resources. The Improvement Authority was just created. I started as a charter member of the Improvement Authority. They had really not ventured into high finance at that point. They were just doing more local.
You started to mention some key projects that moved along the process. So the Ferrin deck with the bookstore. I guess having some Rutgers campus housing in the city.
The Golden
Others,
Triangle.
The Hyatt,
The Hyatt, I arrived when the Hyatt was already developed. And I would say this is where J&J did step to the plate in that it made it a priority for all Johnson & Johnson subsidiaries to use the Hyatt for overnight stays for training. And the Hyatt would never have made it but for that. And they also had brought all the bankers together that they had relationships with, and the bonds for that development were parceled and purchased by all those banks. And so that would not have been a financeable project. New Brunswick also was, I think, number one on a per capita basis for UDAGs. And the Hyatt was a UDAG. And the UDAGs were really driven into New Brunswick from the J&J lobbying point of view, because that was during a Republican administration, and they were so wired that they could get the attention. So for a small city, it got an enormous amount of federal support.
It's either one or two on a per capita basis.
Right. Okay. You would know better than me. Back then, we would just say we were one.
No,
But what about the Hyatt?
Because when you think about it, like the Hyatt was a $6 million UDAG, when $6 million was
Well, a lot of money.
Yeah.
Right. A lot of money.
Now, what about the Hiram district?
So the Hiram district, I arrived when, Professor Holcomb was still wearing the button with the whatever. And that was really a horrible time for me because I was in both camps and probably sympathized more with the historic restoration. And I think Lynch got the short end of the stick because he was really not against it. It was J&J. And there was a lot of pressure from there is an agreement, and this would be interesting if you're talking to J&J people, there is an agreement with I and Pay if you remember the beautiful mural on the
Haas.
right.
Right.
There was an agreement that that building had to be taken down in the IMP agreement, or that he would never show the J&J building as part of his portfolio. And
Why is that? Because it was sticking out.
That's
so
block
was it
review
was
or-
supposed to be in a campus.
Yes, right,
green, and
right.
God forbid you would have this,
Building.
this little
So
gem.
that was driven by pay to
driven
get
by pay.
to get rid of that
To
building.
get rid of that building. And so that was the agenda of Johnson & Johnson. And the people at Johnson & Johnson, I can tell you because basically I reported to them when I was at Devco, believed in clean desk mentality.
Yes.
So they also believed that that looked messy. Hiram Market looked messy.
I see.
And so what was really driving the Hiram Market kind of being excluded was J&J really kind of holding the purse strings and saying, we're really not investing here unless you do something about that. And so all of the lobbyists and consultants for that de-designation was really at the cost of Johnson & Johnson, not at the city. And I think Lynch was in somewhat of a catch-22 saying, I got to keep them here, I got to keep them happy. If I'm going to move this forward, this is what I'm going to sacrifice. And you know what's sad is that the voices for the Hiram Market were really the academics. There was no, in order to keep a politician vested, you need constituent voices, and there was none. I think still I am amazed at the lack of constituent voice through the entire process. Roy Epps was one, but you did not have, outcry. You had students and you had faculty. But you
Faculty
didn't-
who didn't even live there. Although
Yeah,
Tony
a couple-
Allison
Tony
apparently
lived
had
there.
a studio.
Some lived there,
Yeah.
but not. You didn't have an indigenous
Right.
group saying this has been so critical to our,
Right.
our city. How could you let it go?
Mhm.
You didn't have that. You didn't have that.
Do you think that's actually even more broadly applicable?
It's across the board.
With the whole redevelopment process.
I think you didn't have anybody holding any accountability to any of the players, and I would include myself. You had very few engaged groups. You had Roy Epps and you had David
Harris.
And
Who viewed themselves as individuals or representatives of larger numbers?
I
or?
think they viewed themselves as representing the African American community, but they represented a very small pocket, and you had a growing Latino base that was not represented at all. And to be honest with you, everybody had their own agendas at that point. Roy Epps sat on the NBT board. David starts to go into some of the institutions at later dates. So, how independent that voice really was in the process is questionable, in my opinion. You didn't. The strongest voices heard probably for accountability at that point were students, which everybody disregarded because they didn't vote.
And if you had a conjecture, because this was a time when in many other places there were neighborhood groups protesting X, Y, and Z. It seems to be very low profile, if at all, in New Brunswick.
Right.
If you reasons why it was not there.
I think what would have been the real vocal neighborhoods had really lost a lot of that neighborhood fabric because of that turnover from homeownership to investors. I think a lot of people made a lot of money selling their single-family homes and moved to East Brunswick or North Brunswick. And you started to really not have really defined strong neighborhoods. I lived in the Hungarian neighborhood for a long time, not really engaged, not engaged. It's amazing to me the lack of real community-based organizations. Really.
Someone
And still-
suggested to me that the fact that, let's say you had some illegal immigrants, they just wanted to keep a very low profile.
I would
Is
think
that-
that's
is
a
that
thing
the-
for especially the Latino community during that period. That was definite. That absolutely. The African American population here has always been a very quiet kind of presence. It's almost, they were almost overshadowed by the student population, and really never, I don't think really had a voice in anything.
So we've spoken about, again, some key projects, the bookstore, the first university housing, the Hyatt. Any others you think were really like key redevelopment projects that really gave the effort the foundation?
Well, I think getting the first phase of Riverwatch up finally, which was incredibly difficult.
So if you can talk about that.
That was the first market rate housing, unsubsidized market rate housing built in the city in 20 years.
That's where you mean in the
Hiram
Hiram?
the Peach.
Oh, there. Okay.
Around Farg and the Peach.
Right.
Was the first. It was only I think 32 units was the first phase.
Right. That's when you came to the Dean's Council and tried to
get everybody
people
to
to
buy
them. Right.
I didn't do so well. Now we all
We
should
should have
applaud them,
listened,
right?
Don Krugerberg bought one, though. I don't know if you ever
No,
took
you
Don
didn't.
for a
No, I
course.
didn't know. Oh, well, I had Don, but
Right.
so that was.
So the challenge there was you weren't doing unsubsidized rental. I mean, can you
We
talk
were
a little bit
doing
about that?
home ownership. Everybody thought we were crazy. We were giving a tax abatement. Back then, we did a pseudo-tax increment financing where the city basically paid for all the infrastructure for the homes to try to
These
keep
are now the townhouses on Hiram.
townhouses on Hiram. And used a pilot payment in lieu to pay off that investment in the infrastructure. Nobody thought anyone in their wildest imagination would buy a $200,000 home in downtown New Brunswick. A lot of marketing studies talking about it's really going to be an older population that's selling a big home, probably has a house down the shore, comes to New Brunswick, they're working, they're affiliated with the university or the hospital, and you were 2 blocks from Memorial Homes, which was my pet project. And basically everyone believed that there was no way that project would get off the ground unless you could tear Memorial Homes down. So for probably 50% of my time here, we were working on strategies to tear the public housing down.
Which was also part of the larger national effort, though.
Right. At that time, I remember Jack Kemp was the secretary, actually came to New Brunswick. We did a tour. Basically, what we had laid out very early on was very similar to what the Hope 6 project became at HUD, which was completely repositioning and redeveloping and giving people a right to come back downtown, but trying to get those high rises down. Everybody saw that as the real impediment, and then first was Route 18. I think the second one that everybody was worried about was Memorial Homes sitting in the midst of trying to redevelop the central business district.
So actually, if we could go back for a moment with the Hiram, I guess there the decision was deliberately made to have home ownership, and was that reflecting the thinking at the time that it was home ownership gave a more stable...
Right, this was Lynch's mantra, and in the process of developing the Hiram Market, there were many commercial developers, because the commercial market came back before the for sales market came back in the late 80s, early 90s. And we had numerous people who wanted to come in to build office buildings, and basically would have taken us out for everything that we had acquired the property for. And everybody, Lynch really holding everybody's feet to the fire and said, no, we started down this path. We want this to be home ownership. We need people vested here. We have to stay to this. And I think, to his credit, many other politicians would have said anything would be better than just having vacant land sit there. He was definitely of the mindset that, no, I'd rather see vacant land there until we can get the right piece. And that's a hard thing for a politician to do.
And actually, it was later that the first market rental went.
Yes. Yeah, it was after my
and then,
tenure.
if I understand correctly, it was rented up very quickly.
Very quickly.
Because the market was getting
The
stronger.
market just changed, and I think New Brunswick, timing-wise, was just very lucky to be hitting it all at the right time.
Right, so
Was there also an issue then about schools? That they
We just
weren't
never
trying to
thought
pitch
that
to
we weren't
families.
pitching, we weren't even trying to fix schools. It was way beyond the
Right.
agenda.
Right.
And I think that goes to kind of underscore the mentality of what the redevelopment was about.
Mhm.
It wasn't about people living here. It was about who you were going to get to live here, which is very different than some of the other cities that I've been part of their redevelopment. I mean, I don't think a Newark could get away with that agenda.
and part reflecting what we were speaking about a little while ago, the
Right.
nature of the population. All right, so any other like major project that you think were the real linchpins, or
This one, I think this one is
This one.
critical.
Could you talk about that? a little?
Well, as I said, there was a strategy to say, okay, what benefits can we gain from having the university, having the hospital, and how can that become part of the baseline for the redevelopment strategy? And having this was the site of the Mason Grove School. The university knew that it had outgrown the space. It was a horrible space. It was an old, it was an old department store. At the same time, David's office was in a trailer. I remember visiting you.
Yep.
And
Still there, modular building.
Yes, it was a trailer in technical terms.
Yes.
As a planner.
Yes.
And we were trying to figure out, and again, those once every 6-month negotiations was a commitment not to have the planning school built in Piscataway. And again, Joe Whiteside saying, this is crazy, we have land, this could be much cheaper for us, and just constant, negotiations, and until the university said, okay. I think, we were everybody kind of looked at us a little cross-eyed that we were going to mix the planners and the Mason Grove School. I remember the conversations. We thought it would be perfect. We thought having specifically the art students here, because they would come and go at all times. This was another hot spot of not the greatest activity. So we said this will be another great spot to have 24-hour kind of kids, And then we said, look, we have some of the best minds in urban planning, and we have them in a suburb. This doesn't make any sense for the university. Their kids should see the laboratory that they're working in. This doesn't make any sense. And I think with Norm being at the center and having that kind of presence and personality, and David was part of those conversations. And I think people said this makes some sense. And there I would have to tip my hat to the university, making probably more of a commitment than they thought they would ever make to New Brunswick when they committed to do this building.
And I guess there was a layering of subsidies.
Well, at that point, there was this economic recovery program at the state. Again, this is where that role as a state senator, the man's name was Bob Huey, I'll never forget the meeting. We went in, pitched this program. There was state funding available. In fact, first meeting I ever met Chris Palladino. Chris Palladino was at the state when we were pitching the recovery funds for this project. And we laid out, our position. And when the Senate president is sitting in the room, and this is the guy that can make or break, your programs and your career, you have a different way of listening to the pitch. So we rolled it out. I think that we, the one thing is we never went with half-baked ideas. We were really good at, by the time we got to ask someone for something, because of understanding, having him lead it and understand what the state would need to hear, we would go prepared. We had done our research. We had the plans. We would invest before getting there. And we got, I can't remember the number off the top of my head,
And
but
I
I
think
would
it
say
was
it was like
also,
10
it
million.
was also Port Authority monies.
Port Authority money.
Yeah, Jim Hughes says, nobody's come for training yet except for Port Authority. We were supposed to train Port Authority
Yeah.
workers or something.
Right. And that's, I think, whether people like John Lynch or didn't like John Lynch, there, as part of this study in particular, the role of the amount of money he was able to bring home is immeasurable. People just don't understand that. And I, now living in Trenton and having, a husband trying to move a city forward, not having that access and not having people have that access, you can see how you just stopped. You could have great projects. You could be selling it just as good as New Brunswick. But the relationships he had at that point in time in the legislature and on both sides of the aisle, because it wasn't, the Democrats controlled everything, is probably, one
So
of
this
the
was
critical
state
pieces.
monies for infrastructure and housing and economic development, I guess,
This building and
going
yeah.
down the list of the various state entities.
Whether it was the Rutgers budget, if Rutgers is going to commit here and they need X, then he became, he was the guy that drove that budget through the legislature.
I remember speaking to Mayor Senator Lynch, and speaking of the payment in lieu of taxes, which New Brunswick used.
All the
It was a
time.
pioneer. You talk about that some
Sure.
and its role in the
think,
redevelopment?
There was no project that wasn't done with a Fox Lands tax abatement. Basically, it's a percentage of, and under that scenario, it's a percentage of the construction cost that's paid annually. And, it really, I think, made us 10 times more marketable for private investment than any of our counterparts. And I would go around the state and talk about different projects and how much we had collected on taxes, and you would hear, oh, you're crazy, you could have gotten 3 times that amount. And I'd say, yeah, we wouldn't have gotten anything because they wouldn't have come. But every project here was done with a Foxlands tax abatement. And, I have to give the people credit that were on the city council at the time. We were presenting it, but we had incredible support from the council who agreed, yes, we understand that this is, in some instances, a break to the developer or a break to the eventual tenant, but we can see beyond tomorrow. I think that was one thing that when I was writing my notes, you had a lot of people around the table that had longer visions than what I see in a lot of cities today. They were willing to say it's going to take 10 years, we're going to be here in 10 years, we're going to be able to see the benefits. And I think that longer range kind of view, it really took 20 years when you really look at it. But at least they were willing to understand that it was going to take a while until the benefits would come back downtown. We used to say with the UDAGs, yes, they're going in to the Central Business District, but I remember when the first UDAG repayments were coming back, we were doing the senior center in the neighborhood. Lynch's commitment was, you may not be in this first round, but we're going to get to it.
Is that right, that the UDAV repayment goes to the city, which then could be used for any purpose?
Anything. Yeah, that was the greatest thing.
Right.
Obama should bring back UDAGs.
So you really got a double benefit.
Right.
Benefit.
Right.
Yeah. So a lot of new firehouses and senior centers, and I think more could have been done, but at least there were priorities for the neighborhoods that got done.
So if you were to give a grade to the outcome, the redevelopment, I don't know if this is a fair or answerable question.
Well, I think that it succeeded on a variety of levels, and I think it fell short in a couple of areas. I think that, in terms of redeveloping a central business district, I think it had a good plan. I think it was balanced. I think that it valued who was
Balanced
here.
in what way?
Between a university setting, a private entity. Now, when you look at it, a residential component, a walkable city. I'm sure you remember that at one point they were thinking about closing down George Street, or even
There was the pedestrian
mall, right? So I think all of those things that we knew were like really bad urban planning, in the central business district, I think a lot of things went right. I still think that when you look at the retail corridor represents what I call the invisible New Brunswick. And if you come on Saturday afternoon, you see the other New Brunswick. If you come at Saturday at 7 o'clock, you see what everybody thinks is New Brunswick. You see the East Brunswick, North Brunswick, everybody coming to the theater and thing. But you don't see the family shopping at Payless or the lower level stores along the corridor. And I think that invisible population is one of the downfalls in New Brunswick, is that there hasn't been an empowering in the neighborhoods. There hasn't been a lot of investment. And the other big gripe I have is that it seems that at this point in the redevelopment, decisions are made on the basis of what's good to get the project done, as opposed to how does it fit in the puzzle. And I'll give you an example. I think New Brunswick has maxed out on restaurants. It appears that whenever you build a new building, you have to put a new restaurant. But then you know that you're going to lose one or two of your current restaurant base. And so now it's driven by a project as opposed to what's happening in the entire downtown.
I see, yeah.
You were talking earlier about the focus on the CBD and less on the neighborhoods. Just more, any further thoughts in that regard?
I think that...
And I guess rehabbing the stock there, just give us your...
There was we did lease purchase housing was our major neighborhood initiative. We built 200 houses through the lease purchase program. I think that was an incredibly successful model. It kind of petered out once interest rates started to fall, because it was done in double-digit interest rate climate. We had police and firemen buying units. I remember getting a lot of flack because why were police and fire given priority? And because we wanted police and fire to live in the city, and we were fine about saying that. But there wasn't, I think Devco lost some commitment to neighborhoods along the way. Maybe the projects downtown just got so large and so consuming that there wasn't, we did that housing. We rehabbed units. We did 10 units on Oxford Street, which is off of Somerset. I lived in one of those. And so there was big projects, but you also had a commitment to do X number of other projects. I think as they became sexier and bigger, and you really don't have anybody, I think, at Devco at this point that even does any of the kind of community planning. You have smaller pockets of smaller, like affordable developer types or nonprofits that have been trying to, do that along, like Buster Suarez with the Hampton Club and that Route 27 corridor. But really, I still think that the major gateways to New Brunswick, those neighborhood gateways, really don't look that much different than they did 20 years ago. So you can see, when you've entered where the investment occurred. I think you could probably even, draw a circle around it. And I think that's a problem for the city. 27, that entry is still a pretty, nothing kind of corridor.
You mean coming from the
French
south?
French Street, coming from
Except the
Princeton.
New Brunswick High School, I guess, will be.
Well, I would say that's probably the best. And the big fight with the hospital was they turned their back on French Street. And so that, I think, set the tone for what was going to occur as you came up
They turned their back, and then it was just that barren corridor.
It was that barren corridor. It used to really drive me crazy. And
with the parking decks and all that.
well, I think as the Cancer Institute got developed at least there was some openness to the two streets on both sides, but the main first development was just a very solid brick wall, no penetrations.
Yeah.
And as they were talking about, and I think this is another great lesson that New Brunswick has, there was a lot of pressure at that point when the hospital was being developed to allow for pedestrian bridges. And we fought very hard between the parking decks and the pedestrian bridges. And I think we were pretty successful by eliminating that.
The hospital originally wanted the pedestrian bridges so you wouldn't have to step
touch the street. You wouldn't have to touch the street. And that was being pushed, by the J&J mentality. Other things that are kind of like stories from, the kitchen kind of stuff is I think if you ask Lynch today, one of the biggest disappointments for him would be that we worked really hard to get the UDAG for the Golden Triangle, and all during that process, it was not made aware to the city that J&J was going to take a master lease from DKN. And the issue there was, as part of the employment with J&J is a subsidized cafeteria. And if you had workers at the Golden Triangle, which is 200,000 square feet, if they put that subsidized cafeteria, we were not going to get real bang or benefit of the kinds of employment that would bring. And that was a really very bad time when it was announced that they were
So that building had the subsidized cafeteria?
Yes, it did.
It did.
It still does. And there were many restaurants that, in fact, Panico opened the Raritan River based on the completion of Golden Triangle. So many people were watching the Golden Triangle happening and thinking it's at the train station. We're going to get Mayor Lynch. We're going to get all these big spending kind of companies and employees. And to find out that it was Johnson & Johnson at the end of the day, really that was a sad day at City Hall. The other big bone of contention between J&J and the city was they would have signs all along the pathways at J&J, which would say, if you want an attendant to walk you to your car, press this button or something like that. And so there was we had to constantly battle the perception that we were not safe because Johnson & Johnson was reinforcing it with their employees. Right. Don't stay here after dark, and that I think was harder to overcome than some of the other issues that the city had, was just kind of breaking down that J&J people did not step foot in the city after 6 o'clock. So it was almost like what Trenton feels with state workers. It was not easy.
Actually, I've heard two takes on the Little Vest Pocket Park by Old Man Rafferty's. One is this wonderful resource. Two, but it's this locked up resource.
If you interviewed John Heldridge, it was John Heldridge that locked it. He didn't want to get up in the morning and walk by and see homeless people sleeping there, so it was locked.
Well, he was the one who said it was a great idea, that he was responsible for it.
That's
he
what
didn't talk about the locked or unlocked.
That's what I was saying. On the one hand, on the other. Well, in essence, these were some of the hindsights.
Right.
Transferability?
I looked at that because I think about this a lot. It's 4 square miles. It has a major university. It has a Fortune 100 company. And it has a major medical center. I think that's hard to find.
The county, the fact that the county's here?
County seat too. I mean, if you could add that, but I think the critical is a higher, higher education presence, a major hospital, and a Fortune 100. Very few cities can claim to host that. I always look at, since I'm living, I think it's like the tale of two cities kind of. I lived in New Brunswick process, and then I moved to Trenton, where when I moved to New Brunswick you couldn't get a cup of coffee on Saturday morning. Now I live in Trenton, you can't get a cup of coffee on Saturday morning. Why could New Brunswick happen and why can't Trenton happen? And there is no major college. Their major hospital has just been granted the ability to move out of the city. These are the things that if you had a personality or a powerhouse like a Lynch for Trenton that could have stopped capital from leaving and say, no, you're going to invest in downtown and we're going to throw all this money at you to do it, there's a chance that I think a Trenton could turn around. The only city that I think that has the ability to do this is Camden. I think that Camden and with Cooper and what you're seeing Cooper do, and because of the players that are around Cooper that can get the attention of the state, I think that Camden, although coming from a much harder position than where New Brunswick picked itself up, probably is the one place that I think politically has the muscle in the state, and also has the presence of Rutgers, has a major hospital system, and has Campbell's Soup, not to the extent that a J&J, but probably is the only place that I think has, maybe Newark, but I think Camden.
So it's the benefit of location in Camden. You're looking at Philadelphia.
And you're not really competing with all those other Gold Coast, like Newark has to compete with all those other, Jersey City and the like. So I think it is. I think there's lessons to be learned. I've been asked this question before, and I think about learn from where New Brunswick made mistakes, because you can't recreate all the positives and benefits that New Brunswick had. But I think with the amount of investment that's occurred, to still have Remsen Avenue be Remsen Avenue, and Feaster Park be Feaster Park. I think there's another 20 years of work to do.
How about having a Devco in New Brunswick tomorrow? So when doing bricks and mortar,
I'll tell you,
and when
I
doing
think
social,
that was terrific. And I know that in this age everything is this transparency, and that we could not have done what we did at Devco with community members at the table, with transparency and talking about what the strategy and what properties we were going to buy, and it would never have happened. It was an 8-member board. They made the deals. They were the banks. Everybody was at the table, and then everybody left the room. They didn't put it out there in the paper. There wasn't any political agendas in terms of somebody running against somebody else. Most of the people that served on Devco did not live in the city. Was it being a bit of up on high and directing down? It was, but the people had the resources to direct investment and get it done. Now, the larger community group, the hold hands and make everybody feel good, and everybody still felt like they were part of the process. I thought that was a terrific way of doing it, because it wasn't just the 8 people driving it. You still felt like there was a voice. In my opinion, New Brunswick Tomorrow was the cover. It was the cover for the process.
Do you think their annual survey was a very useful thing, or just kind of...
I thought it was interesting. I think the thing that reminds me of what's always in my head about that survey is I remember reading the results. People would say, "Are you happy with the safety in New Brunswick?" No. Are you? Do you think your neighborhood's safe? Yes. So I was always really, and no matter what neighborhood that survey came out of, you always got the same answer. So it was. I liked reading them. I thought it was, especially for someone at that point having to make presentations publicly. I could read where people's heads were at. I would know what the key issues were, and so we could prepare ourselves better. And so I think from that point, that was a great tool to have.
And you found that useful with someone involved in some of these line entities on what to do? You found the survey useful?
I thought the survey was helpful. I thought it gave a pretty good. It just prepared you for the next battle a little bit better. And I have to say that's how I feel some of the processes were about. So it wasn't just an easy road. The other major player that I think cities need are parking authorities. Parking authority played tremendous was critical in this process because the older decks in New Brunswick, their debt had basically been paid off. And so as New Brunswick becomes a destination and the rates can go up, the parking authority starts to make a whole lot of money. So as the parking authority makes a whole lot of money and it does debt for the new deck, they get to amortize that over all of these decks that they had. And so it became financially viable to build these new decks for new projects, where in another city, if they weren't sitting on 2,000 parking spaces as part of their inventory, would never have been able to carry the debt of the new projects. So the parking authority, although the quiet participant in this process, was probably more critical of the newer
it could reduce
projects.
the infrastructure costs that a private developer would have to.
Yeah, because the structured parking is what kills you.
I don't know if this is a fair question, but I guess one take on New Brunswick, it was urban renewal, directed by the power structure. Another take is the city has really been transformed on it. And you have this complement of Devco in New Brunswick tomorrow, public-private partnerships, all these nice buzzwords. And probably it's a shade of gray, but between scenario one, it was just urban renewal directed by a power structure, and B, we have all these nifty things that came together. What is your perspective?
I think that you had, prior to my involvement, you had some really very bright people at the table, and you also, not to come back to Lynch, but you had somebody who was directing redevelopment law at the state level, based upon what we were facing in New Brunswick. And so, I probably, if you said, was there this concentration of power? Absolutely. I think it definitely was 90% on that, in that realm. But what was coming out of it allowed for, I think, longevity of the newest players at the table, to maybe open the process a little more. So I think you're right. I think in the first 10 years of New Brunswick's redevelopment, it was a small amount of people with a tremendous amount of power that directed everything that was going to happen. But as they started to direct it, they left in place, I think, the ability for other people to pick up the ball, and then it could become a more open process. I think, what Chris does every day is very different than what I had to do.
Why is that?
Why is that?
Yeah, how is it?
I remember going up and down the streets of Princeton with, we will give you free rent in the, not Faraday, no, the one now, what's it called?
Kilmer Square?
Kilmer Square. We will give you, because Devco owned it. Devco was a partner in Kilmer Square. We will give you free rent if you will open in Kilmer Square. I remember having meetings with the Gap and saying, we will give you the space that now Starbucks is in, free for 5 years, and being told that wouldn't matter because we could still make 3 times that much if we open in a mall. And so, we were still trying to get people to believe you could do urban retail, or that you could open a restaurant and you could get people to come into the city. So, once you have a baseline of people believing, then your sales tactics or even your horizons are a lot broader. So, I'm kind of envious of Chris at this point because he gets to dream even bigger, but I would say that it was a very top controlled process. There was no community planning at all.
And actually, in terms of the change atmosphere, when you look at the residential developers, these were many, like Matrix, were classic, suburban developers who then began to see there was a market in urban.
Yeah, I think that they drank the Kool-Aid. New Brunswick had started to prove themselves, and I think it's pretty cool. Like when I drive here, to say, "Oh, that really happened." I think I have one of the original plans for the waterfront development district, which shows mid-rise, high-rise buildings. And I remember unveiling it. You probably came to the meeting, and people looking at us and saying, "Yeah, what are they smoking today? This is never going to happen in downtown New Brunswick." And you drive through, and I get the plan out. I'm like, "Wow, I mean, it wasn't right on, but it was close, But the zoning changed so that then, when Matrix came in, there was no parking requirement in downtown. There was no height restrictions in downtown. I mean, we did everything to say, just get us density. And I remember that we used to tease each other and say, when there's a parking problem at 7 o'clock at night on a Friday, we've done our job well. And so,
watch
what you wish for, right? So as I drive around on a Friday looking for a parking space, but you could find a parking space for free. When I used to come, when Stage Left first opened, we used to park, right on the side of the George Street Playhouse. I mean, there was parking. You didn't worry about parking, So, yeah.
It's also been suggested that one reason people were coming to the residential developers was that because of NIMBYism, it was so hard to get any approvals, in the suburbs. And here you could come to New Brunswick and get.
I mean, Matrix, was doing active adult golf course kind of stuff, and that wasn't really having a NIMBY backlash. I think they came because the New Brunswick market, in terms of what people were paying in rent, was just, still in my opinion, just a really good financial structure. You could get a tax abatement. You would get the parking authority to help you on the parking. And then when you looked what your rate of return was on those investments, you had to be crazy not to be trying to do something in New Brunswick. So I think it's a combination. I don't think that they were driven in by smart growth principles or any of that. I don't think that that's the case.
In terms of where we can go for further, resources, I guess, first on printed materials, anything you would have that we can look at?
Oh, sure. I'll look through some of my old stuff and see what's interesting. I think, I might have some. Do you have some of the old plans?
Well, we've been going. I would be nice if I could see some of your old stuff.
Okay.
We've gone to the New Brunswick Library, which has a bunch of stuff. We've gone to University Archives, which has a bunch of stuff, but it's always hit and miss.
John Lynch has a bunch of, not John Lynch, John Heldridge has a bunch of stuff. I'm sure John Lynch may too, but.
Are you going to interview him?
We're trying to.
We'd like to, and actually,
it's a rough time in his life, but I think this is important
we left a card with the current mayor, who I guess was in touch, just saying we'd be very much, want to talk to him, which I think would be very important.
Yeah.
Are you in touch with him?
No, but I really think that he was really critical in this.
Do you think he was more critical than John Heldridge?
Absolutely.
Really?
Absolutely. No doubt about it.
Now, somebody else was mayor when J&J brought in American City Corporation and all that. I forget who. That was Pat Sheehan.
Pat Sheehan.
Yeah, whom we're also interviewing. But why do you say that? I mean, the very beginning story that I guess John has given to us is that in mid-'60s or so, LBJ convened a meeting of major CEOs, and he was concerned about unemployment in cities and wanted corporations to help do something about it. And John Heldridge was given this task by Richard Sellars, and that sort of led to his looking at the Hartford situation and bringing in American Cities Corporation and Leo Molinaro, who's another person.
That was on my list.
Yeah, that we're
Leo
gonna.
Molinaro.
And so, other people we talked to said, oh, he was such a key leader in this, and didn't talk as much about Lynch. Now, would you say, Lynch, I guess, didn't initiate it, but he carried it perhaps much further?
I think that Lynch loved Leo Molinaro. I think what you would find, the difference is that he implemented. He said, okay, I believe in this, and then how do I now implement it?
Okay.
And that's why I think he was critical. I have all respect for John Heldridge. John Heldridge is probably the consummate planner, not the implementer. And And so he can convene people and he could get them excited about a process, but actually getting it done is a completely different kind of personality. And so I think, maybe I'm a little partial. Maybe it's because I'm an implementer type personality. Probably they both deserve, equal amount in terms of being able to bring the right players and get a process that then you could hand it to somebody who could implement. But I don't believe that the university would have stepped up to the plate in the way they did. I don't believe that. I just happened to be lucky and be the fly on the wall. I didn't have anything to offer then. I think my education was just to sit there and, like my mother would say, sit there and be quiet and, be seen and not heard, and I just would, and I would watch this dynamic. I mean, it would be a screaming match between Lynch and Bloustein and Sellars, and then at the end of the day they wound up laughing. But I think the most critical one was when I'll never forget it. We sat in a room in the Hyatt. I was Devco president. He wanted the commitment of the university to do the student housing. We still had not gotten it. The woman had brought in a tray of baked goods and coffee, and it was off to the side. And I remember he picked up, I didn't know if he was going to throw it, or I was a nervous wreck, and he started to slam the coffee cups in everyone's face. And we're not leaving here until I have a commitment from this university. I mean, it was a passionate investment. It was not.
And Heldrich didn't.
He wasn't even in the room.
Yeah, right.
But kept, I think, in his defense, kept J&J committed to the process, because along this way, a lot of people changed at J&J.
Right.
And there was a lot of short-term memories of, well, there was a commitment to do this, and there was, you meeting with Bob Gamcourt, by any chance at J&J?
No.
Robert Gamcourt was the head of real estate, who was brought in, and I would say he began what I would call the second guard. The old guard had moved on. He had to deal with Heldrich sitting in the office, down on George Street. But he was now saddled with all people saying, why are we committing all this money? Why are we involved in New Brunswick? And I would deal with him because he was on my board, and we would have to answer very difficult questions. I was called before the executive committee of J&J a few times. And all questioning, why are we here? Why are we doing it? The Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, New Brunswick is spelled out. Somebody did tell you this, right? That New Brunswick is the only non-healthcare related investment that the foundation is allowed to make. At one point, the foundation said no more money. I thought I was going to be the last president of Devco, and they were just going to say shut out the lights. I'm sorry, I have 2 Blackberries going, and I don't know where it is. So I would give Heldrich credit that whenever possible, he tried to hold J&J accountable to their commitment. So I think in fairness, maybe I spoke too soon in saying that.
Right.
Well, I guess wearing my urban planning professor hat, there's no question that John Lynch was talking about infill and redevelopment, and the mechanisms we use today when it just wasn't done. That's right.
So Bob Gamcourt, is he still around?
Chris Palladino may have. He sat a while on the board. He may have retired, but I believe that he still lives in the vicinity. And then, I can see him, but I can't think of his name. The other chairman of Johnson & Johnson, Campbell. Are you meeting with him?
Campbell?
We're
meeting with him next week, in fact.
Okay.
But
So
Jim
he was
Burke and
point
Richard
person.
Sellars, I guess, are not
Are they
in a
even
condition
licensed?
to be able to talk
When
to them.
Rich Sellars used to, remember, I was all of 25 at the time. When he would walk in the office, had this. Do you remember him? Had this big mane of gray hair. He
Really?
must have been 6'6", 6, 7.
Really?
And he would walk in, and I would say, "If God, this is what God looks like," you know. And he would make me, you know, I would just start to shake, you know. I would just start to shake.
Well, there's a J&J mold.
Right, there's a J&J mold, and they would all call, and I've never been called this in my life, but they would all call me Chrissy. So, Chrissy, what do you have on the agenda today? And I would be like, I couldn't even talk, you know. I would just try to, I would get all nervous and everything, but he would walk in and he just commanded, you know, you would just sit
So
up straight.
he was still the head of J&J in the early 80s?
Mhm.
Okay.
I think it was
And Burke
only-
was after him?
I was, you know, I hadn't arrived in any kind of powerful role or leadership role. I was just this little thing that would run around and get the maps and color them the pretty colors and make everybody understand what we were doing. But I would get to sit in on these meetings, and I would, not that you asked me, but I have to share my very famous New Brunswick story. Become Devco president. You're not allowed to write this in. I become president of Devco, and Lynch calls me to Trenton for a meeting, and it's my first board meeting with Devco, and all the J&J boys. They were very big on being on time, and that you couldn't have a messy desk. And in the 80s, as you remember, women used to wear, you know, man-tailored suits and, you know, with the little bow around, you know. Okay. So I go to Trenton, and of course I'm coming back on Route 1, and I'm late. And I'm rushing to get to Devco offices, and I get into the office, and I had a beautiful office. And my office was here, and the doors opened, and I had a conference table, and they're all sitting around the conference table waiting for me. And as I step in, there's no chairs. I said, oh, shit. So I go outside, and there's a secretary's chair with wheels, and I'm going to roll it in. And there was a large threshold, and it was wood. And I said, oh, I don't want to make a lot of noise by rolling this over. I'm going to pick it up. And as I pick it up and I walk into the Devco board meeting, the chair was broken. And the bottom falls out between my legs. And I have to throw the chair into the room. And then I proceed to fall on it and get cut and blah, 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 blah. And it wasn't Dick Sellars, it was another guy. Another J&J big guy stood up and said, well, Chrissy, we've heard of crashing meetings, but you brought it to a new level. And all I could think of is, like, is my skirt over my head at this point? You know, I don't even want to move, you know. And that was my first Devco board.
It was all planned.
Die.
It was all
I
planned.
thought I was going to die. But
So Chris Palladino became head of Devco when you left? Was there anybody in between?
They put a consultant in. J&J put a consultant in when I left. And then Chris took it shortly thereafter.
And I guess Steve O'Connor who was
NBT.
almost finishing his doctorate, by the way.
Oh, okay.
Well, hopefully in a month.
He was at
He was
NBT.
head of NBT for a while. Is that, okay.
Right. Before Jeffrey Vega.
Right. But you're talking to
Ted Hargrove.
Ted Hargrove.
Right.
He was critical.
And who was there anybody between him and Steve O'Connor?
Not that I can remember. I mean, you know, Ted played a critical role because he had to be the face to the process.
Right.
I think he gets very little credit for the role that he had to play. He had to make it look like it was transparent in the process that wasn't.
I see.
And he was the one that sat with David Harris, and he was the one that had Roy Epps on the board, and you know, so very mild-mannered, really good guy that just, you know, carried the torch and did what needed to get done, and never, you know, and really enabled all the other players to do what they needed to do, and he gave it cover and credibility because he was a good person.
Right.
So I give him a lot of credit.
Any other thoughts? Or
Who didn't we get to? What was it? Leo. I thought that covered all.
Leo, we had an appointment with him.
How old is he these days?
I don't know. He lives in a retirement community in Philadelphia.
Oh, well, that's good. They're
And
close
his wife
by.
was ill,
we'll
so
find out. We'll find out.
and we're going to interview Harry Cobb. IMP is not doing interviews anymore. His partner, I guess, Yes, Harry did a lot of the New Brunswick related work.
Becker.
Becker.
That was a person at J&J.
Becker.
Don
Becker.
Don Becker.
Okay, what did he do?
Okay, so what happens is Heldridge retires, they have that mandatory retirement, and
Right.
they go to the old age office at the
Across
end of
the
George
street.
And
For anyone involved in community service, if they don't do service, they
you
don't
can't
get an
get it,
office
right.
there.
And Don Becker becomes the John Heldridge inside J&J.
Okay, so he was like corporate relations or something?
He was corporate, and I guess he served for a little while as chair of Devco. He kept Riverwatch, the first phase, alive. He was rough, but believed in it, and was one of those corporate guys, a soldier of Heldridge, to constantly make sure
Mhm.
that this process was being preserved. So I don't know if he's around at all, but he
Okay.
was a really good guy.
Okay.
And then I'm sure you're interviewing Tony and Holcomb and all those people.
Well, we had
right?
Tony.
How about Beauregard? He gave me such a hard time when I was here.
He would collaborate with.
He's where, at Columbia now?
At Columbia, yeah.
Yeah,
He heads
right.
their program.
I know, I saw that. Yeah, he gave me an F in something because he said it was a memo that said, pretend you're the city planner for New Brunswick and there's going to be a heliport, blah, 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 blah. And so I read this report because I could go and then I pull the file and I read the heliport file. He says, well, you didn't do anything. I said, you didn't tell me I had to pretend I was somebody else. And when I read the report, I did it. Yeah, he really did like the administration. So, but.
So that sentiment is in part.
So you having fun doing it?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, first of all, I've been around a long time.
You've been doing it, right?
You
You lived it.
And I've observed from my window. You think about boy, if you had the brains.
So are you going to interview him?
I guess we could. He thinks he should interview me just because I knew John and I was a neighbor of Ralph Voorhees.
Oh, really?
You know.
I've been fortunate in having had some wonderful students who have then proceeded apace to do great things.
But we interviewed John Heldridge. We did interview Ralph, who kept apologizing that his memory isn't what it used to be. We interviewed Andy Baglivo. Eric Krebs was interesting.
Oh.
That was fascinating. That was fascinating.
Yeah, Eric was great. He went all the way back to the 1960s and his 74-seat theater
in
Yeah,
the old
with-
supermarket. Yeah.
With some incredible.
Well, even before that, on Easton
with some
Avenue.
incredible actors.
With Al
then-
Pacino, who
Al
came in and
Pacino,
directed,
yeah.
and yeah, that was interesting. And how in 1986 or 7, he said one of his board members in the new George Street Playhouse building on Livingston Avenue, one of his board members met him at the base of the steps, and he was hoping to open a season with some experimental play on AIDS, which back then he said wasn't, very popular. And one of his board members said, we really like to have nice, commonly known plays, and we don't need any of this experimental stuff. And he said, it's time to go.
Oh.
Right. So that was.
Oh,
I guess
that must have been terrific.
Well,
Yes.
you're free to see all of
You're-
this. We
yeah,
have
okay.
the audio and the video.
How about Rick Kahn, Crossroads?
Yeah, that's a good idea. I don't know where he is now, but
He comes back every
Really?
once in a while to do some
Because
stuff
when-
here. It would be interesting because of the old Crossroads Theater
Yes.
and that coming down. And
well, we heard a lot about that from Eric. But yeah,
Because when you think, what are the new anchors in an urban area? Health is clearly big in a lot of places. Art and restaurants. I mean, that
Right.
becomes
That becomes
a
it.
big. It's your new anchor stores.
right.
yeah, I think that would give that. I mean,
And just think how long it took before New Brunswick had some national chains in the retail. I mean, it was what, maybe 10 years ago? It was
10 years ago, right, was the first chain. I mean, how long has Starbucks been in? About 10, 12 years, maybe.
Right.
It's still hurting.
Yeah.
You
Downtown's
have Radio
still
Shack
hurting.
and GNC,
Right.
but until rather
Dunkin'
recently,
Donuts.
And then the other interesting thing is the number of people who control the real estate on George Street. there was only like 3 people, 3 families that controlled a lot of the,
Right.
and what was happening was they weren't willing to cut deals, and that's when Devco started. One point, Devco was the largest taxpayer in the central business district for that purpose.
I
was
see.
because you couldn't cut deals. They
Yeah.
just wouldn't cut deals. So you still had, like, you remember, like, the
So what, you had
tobacco
to
head
use eminent
shops.
domain?
Right.
You had to use eminent.
Yeah, you had the head shops and that kind of stuff, and then you had we zoned out residents over commercial, and I guess they rezoned it back in, and you know, so yeah, those people would remember
Right.
those things.
We also interviewed Kenneth Wheeler, and he
Oh,
talked
okay.
about the former bank building that he wanted to get Rutgers to buy for visiting faculty, because he said it had beautiful marble fireplaces. And he said Marv Greenberg was always so cheap, and he wouldn't put any money
Money
into
in.
things. So
Yeah.
And he was
not
also
good.
very honest in saying the
He's not what?
university, given the process, that they never could come to a decision.
he said it would take
No,
him
would have
20
taken 10
years.
years to come to no decision. Yes.
Right.
Maybe that's why I kept saying, what does budget approve? We're not moving until we,
Yeah.
have a
Wow.
decision.
That's something
I was
I didn't
thinking
know.
about Alvin Rockoff. He was, I know he's really sick.
He's not well. No.
really, really sick, but that's another name.
Yeah, right.
You know, whether you can get an interview or get somebody to talk about. I mean, because that was John Lynch's go-to guy.
Oh,
At the
really?
university.
He was on the board of governors then?
He was chair of the board of governors,
Mhm.
and
Can we
then
ever
went over to.
get you to teach a class here?
Sure, love to.
Maybe we co-teach a class
That would be fun.
In housing?
Yeah.
on, we can use New Brunswick.
Yeah.
Between these tapes and other stuff.
Right.
I love it.
Michael's
No.
teaching a class for us.
I know, he told me.
This
Yeah.
fall.
So I am trying to get him to write a check too. Yeah.
I
It just
understand.
takes a little longer.
I know.
But I have, let's see, I have four graduates from the program that work for me.
Oh, is that right?
And
Wow.
one that just finished last year,
Who was that?
Leanna Schaefer.
Mm.
I don't know if you had her, but it's a lot of fun, you know,
Mhm.
to have them, you know, in class, and they'll go to some of the housing stuff. You know, my professor said this. I said, "What type of professor is what he's talking about?"
That is funny.
So thank you for inviting me.
Okay,
It's
well,
my
thank
That's our
2
pleasure.
cents.
It's our pleasure.
I'm going to actually meet Fred and Susan now, since I